I am so happy to welcome Sean Posey to the podium.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for having me here. I really appreciate it, especially since I'm a new face and I don't think anyone except Stacy knows who I am. And thank you, Stacy, for being so cordial, inviting me to come here to talk to you folks. Hopefully, I probably should have asked, I don't really know what type of speakers you're used to getting. I assume obviously something very related to genealogy, but maybe not. I don't know, maybe you have some surprise guests. I'm not going to be talking about that genealogy per se. I'm going to be talking about local history, but I'm going to try to bring the conversation around, so hopefully I can shed some light on or help illuminate some of your own personal research. Once again, I don't really know a lot of the research that you're doing, but I did hear some people mention some local history here. So my broad topic is going to talk about the importance of local history and place, and how local history and place shape communities, shape families, and hence shape individuals. So when we're doing research about a family member or our ancestral line or whatever, there are some people, I should say, some people who get very interested in that, and they're very focused on finding information about one person or one particular line of their family without thinking about, what was the greater context that shaped the circumstances of the lives of your relatives or your ancestors. What community they live in, what was their job, if it's sometimes possible to find out, what ethnic group, what religion. That all had a very powerful effect, especially long ago. Now, this is something that's often very difficult to impress on young people who have a hard time understanding how closely tied people were to place, because people are less tied to place probably, at least in this country, than they've ever been. I'm sure maybe some of you can relate to that. Now, come back and talk about the importance of placelessness that we've kind of come to, where people move around all the time and don't have a particular connection to any one place, and it's important to, and its impact on local history. So I'm going to start off with two quotes that are not mine, and I'm going to ask you to keep these in your head as I talk, and hopefully when I get to the very end it'll make sense what I was, why I actually mentioned these in the first place. The first is from a trained historian that kind of specializes in local history, which is interesting because, as you may or may not know, a lot of academic historians sometimes look down on local history and say, well, that's not worthy of serious academic discussion. History that focuses on very intensely on a particular locale. And he's kind of been a defender of the idea that local history isn't very important. And this quote comes from an essay that he wrote called, appropriately enough, Local History. More concretely, we can say that structures, spaces, homes, neighborhoods, villages, and inhabitants define and distinguish a place. In singular, unique, and kaleidoscopic combinations, a place in turn informs young minds and the veins and roots of ingrained habits in older citizens. Sidewalks, storefronts, alleys, fields, churches, and schools host the rituals, ceremonies, and celebrations which individuals and generations experience and know, make and represent their lives through. The second quote comes from a book that I would encourage you to pick up if you ever get a chance. It's called Why Place Matters, and it's a series of anthologies talking about the importance of place, local history. There's even some discussion of genealogy in there. And this comes from an essay in that book. Local history carries with it the potential to reconstruct our own and our ancestors' everyday lives, the machines and tools with which they worked, the goods and objects among which they lived, and the faces and groups in which they were raised, nurtured, had ambitions, and lived out distinct fates. So think about those two quotes, and then I'll dive into a little bit what I'm talking about. So family history, or the history of individuals, really depends on the history of places and migration. Two things I'm going to talk about. As I mentioned earlier, for most of human history, people were very tied to one particular place. And this goes on until almost the 50s or the 60s, very recently. So for thousands of years, people were lived, born, and died within, excluding the time of hunter-gatherers, within a very miles of where they were born. That's where their whole lives were. And today, especially with the advent of the internet, people tend to think of their whole lives as almost without a fixed place, even though it is still true that we are somewhat attached to place. So I'm going to talk about really the importance of place and then a little bit of migration. But I should probably tell you at least a little bit about my own migrations, just so this makes sense. I was born here, but I was raised mostly in Akron and Canton, and I spent time on the West Coast, and I spent some time in Florida, and then I came back here when my grandmother started having some problems. But I had no personal memory and no historical memory of this place. So when I got here, one of the first things that interested me as a photographer was the expanse, the wide expanse of abandoned steel mills and industrial structures. And I started photographing a lot of these and crawling in and out of them and going down to Poland Avenue and all these types of things. And none of it, I wasn't raised around any of it. No memory of this at all. So this is all very fascinating to me. But I became interested in, well, who worked in these places? Who built these places? And then I also started photographing neighborhoods like abandoned city blocks and old businesses. And I was thinking in my head, well, how did this mill relate to this neighborhood store, relate to this neighborhood? Who were the people that gave these places life? And I kind of set about in my own initial research to kind of reconstruct these places. So sometimes I was interested in some of my own family members. So I was interested in individuals, the history of individuals, but I wanted to tell their stories through the history of communities and through local history. So by understanding the history of the city through the history of industry, the history of neighborhoods, the history of neighborhood businesses, helped me understand who were the people that came to Youngstown, who were the ethnic groups that built its institutions, and what might have their lives have been like. So talking about migration, and I give you a couple examples that might help you think about some of your own work. And I'll mention two specific groups. So one of the earliest groups to come to Youngstown were the Irish. So the Irish migration was actually a really deeply traumatic one, because a lot of it was driven by the Irish potato famine. If you might know anything about it, the Irish were very overly dependent on this one staple, the potato. And when there was a massive famine, it killed 1 million Irish men, women, and children, which is would be a phenomenal number today. But it was huge back then, especially for this little island, which was a much smaller population. So that kind of drove a lot of them out and here to the United States. And the first Irishmen and women came and settled in places like Bottle Hill. If you've never heard this name, I'm going to run you through some very old Youngstown neighborhood names no one remembers now, hardly. Bottle Hill, which was near Sheehy Street on the east side. Vinegar Hill, which was on the lower east side towards Albert Street. Kilkenny, a very interesting Irish named neighborhood that was off of Poland Avenue. There's very little of it today. The kind of the historic infrastructure of it was ruined by the sewage treatment plant there, and then the expressway that comes through there now. And also Smoky Hollow. So Smoky Hollow is an interesting example if any of you know about it. We often kind of think about Smoky Hollow today as being an Italian enclave, but it started out as an Irish enclave, and also with some Welsh and some English. And if you go down there and you look at the street names, you can see that there are no Italian place names. They're either Irish names or they're English names. So that's one last visible example of the influence of the Irish people on that neighborhood. And if you would be doing research into the Irish community or into Irish relatives, it would become important for you to understand that the Irish also faced a lot of discrimination when they came here. And so when you go back and look, you'll see a lot of Irish people were municipal workers. They did something for the city. They worked in the fire department, or of course, and stereotypically, though somewhat true, you have the Irish cop, which you see in historical dramas and films. But this was true. The Irish were kind of constrained to these certain elements, and they were also constrained to certain neighborhoods in the city in many cases. But so in that sense, place in America constrained them and helped define who they were. But despite of that, they also influenced their own environment. They weren't just acted upon, they were also acting upon the area by giving it their own specific place names, by building their own institutions and churches. And the same goes for another group, which is kind of almost a case in and of itself, African Americans. So the first African Americans came here kind of around the same time as the Irish. A lot of them were ex-slaves coming up through the Underground Railroad. There was some freed men and women that came here around that time. But the real boom in the African American population comes at the end of World War I, where you have the first of two great migrations, the largest internal migrations in the history of the country, in which millions of men, women, and children come out of the South into cities in the North trying to escape Jim Crow and sharecropping and find better jobs in the steel mills or wherever here, or what they often thought were better circumstances. And like the Irish, the African Americans faced a great deal of discrimination. There were informal laws of segregation. If you go back and you pay attention to a lot of these early African American societies, they've often had very colorful names, you'd find that the meeting places were always in people's houses. And it's kind of a mystery until you realize that because of segregation, there was no place for them to go. So if you were going to have a society, you were going to have meetings, it was probably going to be in people's houses. And eventually, over time, as you get African American businesses, then that kind of expands out a little bit. And when we focus on groups like this, especially ethnic groups, if you go back and read local histories, a lot of it gets to churches first and foremost, which is important because churches were very central parts of people's lives, especially because there was so much more religious attendance and a much higher percentage of religious belief than there is now. But we kind of, I think, unfortunately often end there, and we forget that there were other neighborhood institutions that were really important to people. Corner grocery stores, people who worked as hucksters or even knife sharpeners, and then later you even had neighborhood theaters. So at one time, 30s, 40s, and 50s, you could go back and look at Youngstown, almost every neighborhood had a little theater in it. And these shaped people's lives too, so people weren't just shaped by the mill or by the church, but they were shaped with their relationship by the guy down the street that sold them groceries on credit when they needed it, or their first introduction to movies and film at the local theater, things of that nature. And I think another important thing to look at in your research are there's some people who find that their relatives owned businesses. But what you find is they can tell you a lot about their relative in some sense, but they know next to nothing about what it was they did. So if you had a relative or an ancestor that was a cobbler, or they owned a dry goods store or something, that gave them a different position in the community, a different sense of responsibility, and a different, really a different environment, because many, if not most of those people actually lived above the stores where they worked in many cases. So their lives and their work were intertwined even more closely than the people who went and worked in the mill, even though, of course, in many cases the mill was almost right on top of you too. So when you look at, say, for example, the Croatians, so a lot of the Croatians came and settled down on what is now 422, but used to be West Federal Street, down by what they call the River Bend now in the Mahoning River, which is past the Mr. Peanut Bridge. And one of the most notable things you hear about the Croatians now that still exists was the St. Peter's and Paul Church, which was built down in Covington. But if you go back and look in some of the historical records, you'll find that it wasn't just the church and the school that was the center of their lives, but the Croatians opened businesses, and they gave them names that reflected their pride in being Croatian, like the Balkan Bakery or the Zagreb Cafe. So the Croatians were in a way coming here and imprinting part of their culture on the local part of Youngstown. And it makes sense, because when you think about what Youngstown was, it was a patchwork of ethnic groups all together, each being shaped by their environment, whether it be by discrimination in the workplace or by anti-Catholicism or something like that, but also in turn shaping the environment themselves. So they weren't just acted upon, they were acting upon the environment too. And I think another thing that's really important about all of this, and especially about important of parting the work that you might do to young people, which in a lot of cases are not going to have any idea and maybe any interest, at least initially, is when you think about, and if older people will probably recognize this, you think about the time we live in now. We live in a time where people have very low confidence in most of the major institutions of American life, which was untrue of the recent past. And also people have very impersonal relationships with a lot of the institutions in our life. So if I need a shirt now, I might go down to the mall and buy it from a store that's headquartered in somewhere outside the state or the country, and I might buy it from some young man or woman who I have no relationship with of any kind, and then I might go to Walmart and buy my groceries there, once again not knowing anyone I'm dealing with. Whereas in the past, People would go downtown, get a shirt from someone who they might have a close relationship with, who actually worked at a store that was headquartered here locally, bought their groceries from the guy down the street who they knew their kids, knew them. You know, they might go down there and just hang out. It was a world where people were much more rooted in place and people were much more familiar and knew the people around them. So it's interesting to go back and think about that when you do research and realize, you know, even our relatives from the 1950s or 40s lived in a world vastly different from ours. And I don't just mean that they didn't have Google or cell phones, but their interpersonal relationships were so much different, and it's just not really historically that far away. And as a teacher, I've tried to explain that to young people, and they have a very difficult time understanding it. They're like, well, yeah, of course you don't know, the people at the grocery store. Of course, everything around here is owned by people. That doesn't make any sense to them, but I try to impart to them the importance of these micro interactions that people had in the past with everyone around them and how close they were. And I think that's a reason why you see people have a strong attachment to Youngstown neighborhoods. In many cases, neighborhoods that are long gone. And just think about, does anybody here go to the Briar Hill Festival every year? Or ever been?
Stacy.
Right. Well, Stacy's there by default. She can look out her window and see it going on. But every time I go there, it's fascinating to me that people are there, and a lot of them older, but not necessarily all older people, who are there to celebrate a neighborhood whose historical core was destroyed by the widening of West Federal Street and the expressway, but 50 years ago. So the neighborhood is still there, but the historical part that they're celebrating is not. But it's fascinating to think that 5 decades later, people are still attached to this place in some way. They might live in California, and they might take their only vacation trip of the year to come back to be at the Briar Hill Festival. And it says something about the importance of place in people's lives, especially people in the not very distant past, that they could still be so attached to a place that they grew up in. But it makes sense because this is where their values were shaped. This is where they might have had their first job. This is where they might have met their wife. I mean, place is very important to families and communities and tracing the history of it. And Briar Hill is a great example. And if you were interested in digging into it further, one of the gentlemen that helped start the festival, who's now passed on, Tony Trollio, wrote a couple of books about Briar Hill. And they're interesting kind of eclectic books. It's a mix of local history. He had families write in essays about various aspects of Briar Hill, things they remembered, people they remembered. And when you read through it, you see some of these people were in their 70s, 80s, 90s. For example, there was an essay by a gentleman who had become a very successful lawyer, become very wealthy, moved far outside the community. He wrote this essay. The first thing he wrote was, "Briar Hill is still with me," even though he left the neighborhood 45 years before and had never seen it since. So that, I think, really shows you how important place is in shaping people's lives and how local history is not irrelevant. Local history has shaped us all because in some sense, we're still tied to a place. We grow up in a certain place. It shapes who we are. We take who we are elsewhere and share that with other people. So it's important, I think, when you're doing family history or doing genealogical research to always keep that in mind. Where were these places that my ancestors came from, and how might have, we'll never know for sure because it's too difficult to find out, how might that have shaped them? Now, the last thing I want to leave you with is the importance of preserving local history. So we're losing local history all the time, but we always are, because people pass on. Most of the time, people don't pass on their historical memory. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're losing attachment to place. Young people don't understand where their relatives came from. They don't know much about where did grandma and grandpa come from. How did they grow up? Sometimes they're not interested. Sometimes they're distracted by technology or what have you. But I would encourage people to, if possible, think about this: doing oral histories with your friends and relatives. It's not overly difficult. The Youngstown State used to have a workshop program, I don't know if they still have it, where you can go and they tell you how to properly do an oral history, how to record it, how to transcribe it. But if not, you can always go and find out how to do it on the internet. It's not complicated. I would encourage you to do that, especially with older people that you know. Get their story, get it written down. You can even submit these to the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. And in a way, that leaves a record for future historians or future people who are interested in local history to go back and look on. Plus, it preserves a vital part of your own family history or a part of a friend's family history. I would also encourage you to write down your own story, and I don't mean necessarily write a memoir, though that would be, I think, be great if you're up to it. But think about what were the places that shaped my life, and who were the people and the institutions that shaped my life, and write them down and give it to someone that you would entrust, who you think would be responsible enough to keep that and pass it on, because you never know in the future who might find that and what they might be able to garner from that about what our time was like, what your place was like, and what imprint did you leave on the local area, your own little piece of local history. And I'll leave you with one more last thing. This is a quote from me, and then I'll let you go. We shouldn't just look at local history as an adjunct to genealogy, but instead as a necessary accompanying element. The history of a person or a family is very difficult to understand without also understanding the history of the area, town, or region which was their place in the world. How did that shape them? How did they shape their own places? And how did that contribute to their own story and to yours? Thank you very much.